So hi everyone, my name is Shoshana Jakobovits and I'm here to present to you the results of my work on my master thesis over the past few months on Can Machines Learn Code? A case study in deep learning and partial compilation. So as an introduction, I will first briefly motivate this work. Why would we want to teach machines code? I will then provide some background on word-to-vec and vector embedding, since they're essential to understand the techniques that I'll present here. And then I will formulate a distributional hypothesis for code. More on that later. Then, moving to the main part of this work, I will present to you inst to vec for instruction to vector, and embedding space for LLVM IR statements. I will then show you how this embedding space can be used in practice to learn on tasks to use machine learning on code in a framework that we dubbed Neural Code Comprehension, or just NCC. Finally, I will conclude with some ideas on future work. So, why teach machines code? Well, software in general is becoming more and more ubiquitous in our lives, and in particular, open source software is growing in large numbers. So the GitHub Octoverse 2017 reported 24 million total users, more than 25 million active repositories, as well as over 1 billion public commits since September 2016. So much so that recent works have come to describe this phenomenon as part of the big code era, in which researchers develop methods geared towards automatically classifying, understanding, and analyzing bodies of code. Applications of machine learning on code thus include, among others, automatic optimization, identifying code duplication, or vulnerability analysis. Now, a number of these methods which use machine learning on code do so by getting some inspiration from the world of natural language processing. While one might think, well, what does natural language processing have to do with automatic code processing? This relies on a hypothesis called the naturalness of software hypothesis, which was introduced in the paper that I had on the slide just before. So this hypothesis says software is a form of human communication. Software corpora have similar statistical properties to natural language corpora, and these properties can be exploited to build better software engineering tools. In other words, there are some properties that human languages and programming languages have in common, and these justify us using the same statistical methods on both. Now, that being said, it is important to just keep in mind a few key differences between natural languages and programming languages. The first one being that while natural languages read linearly, programming languages have distinct structural features. So take, for example, these first few sentences of the Wikipedia article on cats. You typically start your article from the beginning and read one word after the next, sentence after sentence. Take, on another hand, this example of a Fibonacci function calculator. In this function, you have two branching statements, so depending on a value, you might run one line of code or a different line of code. You have a return statement that would go back to wherever this function was called, as well as another return statement that is recursive and would make you start the function all over again. So there's really nothing linear about the way this function and these few lines of code are run. Yes.
So I'm not convinced.
You're not convinced?
I mean, natural language has a lot of structure, right? I mean, like you have like certain structures, how you form a sentence, how you like add sub-clauses to your sentence. So there seems to be, like if you would use the same highlighting on the right-hand side or the left-hand side, I mean, there seems to be a lot of structure.
So I'm not claiming that there's no structure in both. Quite the contrary. I think the naturalness of hypothesis applies because there's structure in both and there is some sort of similarity in the structures. What I'm saying is the natural way of processing human language is by reading one word after the next. And typically if you open a book, you might, skip a few pages, but then wherever you start, you would then take one word after the next. Code, on the other hand, the natural way of processing it is to run it. And when you run it, you will absolutely not run it linearly. That's the point that I'm trying to make here. And I think this example is quite strong. A further difference between natural language and programming language is the fact that natural languages make use of local references, so words refer to words that were just before or just after, while programming languages can refer to a completely different part of the code. So my Fibonacci function right here, I could call it from a totally different part of my file, or perhaps even from a different file. Hence the long-range dependencies. Furthermore, while in natural language words come from a set vocabulary, and usually in with albeit some exceptions, a word in one sentence has the same ensemble of meanings as a word as the same word coming from a different document. That is not at all the case for code. Code displays a high rate of neologisms. When I say neologism here, I mean that this N, for example, I chose N, but I really could have chosen anything else, right? I could have called this my number, I could have called this P, I could have called this flower, and I still would end up with the exact semantic equivalent code. So by neologism, I mean there is this word N, which I invented, it is in that sense new, and N in the function that I wrote might mean something entirely different from an N in a different function in some other code corpus. Same for Fibonacci, I could have called this fib or myfunc and ended up with the same code. And then the last difference that I'd like to point out is that natural language is a lot more semantically robust than programming language is. So here I struck out a few words from the Wikipedia article on cats, and I bet that if I were to give each one of you these paragraphs with those words struck out, you still would have a pretty good idea of what this text is talking about. And I struck out, I believe, 1 word out of 4 regularly, so there was 1 word out of 5. On another hand, take this little piece of code. If I were to output the 10 first numbers of the Fibonacci sequence, I'd end up with something like this. And were I now to change something minuscule to my code, say for example, replace this 2 by a 1 and run it again, the 10 first numbers that I'd obtain are those. So you see how a very small difference in the code can, change a lot to the output. So these differences are really important to keep in mind as we then use natural language techniques on code. Great. Let's now take a step in the world of natural language processing and talk about word2vec, which is a method that computes vector embeddings for code. Now, why would you want to compute vector embeddings for code? Well, imagine that you're designing your awesome machine learning method, which takes words as inputs. How are you then to represent these words numerically in your neural network? Well, the first straightforward way is to think, oh, well, why don't I do just one hot encoding, right? I represent each word by a vector of length n, whereby n is the dimension, the number of words in my vocabulary, and just index them and set this index to 1. This representation has obvious disadvantages, the first one being that we're dealing with very high dimensions. For a typical English application, the number of words in a vocabulary could be several hundreds of thousands. And another big disadvantage of this representation is that there's no notion of how similar words are in the way that they are represented. So you and I, we all see in this that there are similarities between blue and blue, similarities between blue and orange. These words have commonalities, but these commonalities aren't translated in the way they're represented. What would be a lot better than that is to represent words as continuous vectors. So we would have them be a lot shorter. We would have vectors of length v, which is an embedding dimension of, say, a few hundreds. And we would represent them with continuous numbers in which the components and the topology of the space includes some type of information on what those words mean. So as an example, just invented off the top of my head, you could imagine that the first component of the word blue and blues would be similar. And this would then tell your neural network that you use on a downstream task that these two words have something in common. There is something similar. Great. How does word2vec do this? Well, it's based on an idea that comes from the world of linguistics from the 1950s. So let's take a step back to there and talk about the distributional hypothesis. This hypothesis says that words that occur in the same contexts tend to have similar meanings. Or a representation that captures much of how words are used in a natural context will also capture much of what we mean by meaning. Let's look at this with an example. I hope it'll become clearer. Look at these 3 sentences. In each of these 3 sentences, only one word changes: the cat sat on the mat, or the dog, or the puppy. Now, what this hypothesis says is, from the fact that the context of these words are the same, the sat on the mat, you would infer that these entities all have something in common. The cat, the dog, and the puppies are things that tend to sit on mats. For another example, if I have the cat lay on the mat, the cat sat on the mat, and the cat sits on the mat, you'd infer from the words cat on the mat that lay, sat, and sit have something in common. So this is what we're trying to do: learn the meaning of a word from its context. How does this work now in a neural network architecture? So let's start on this side. The way that you would input then, to train word2vec embeddings, you use a skipgram architecture. You input a word as a one-hot encoding, what I showed you before, that representation that we don't really like. So this first layer has a dimension of n, whereby n is the number of words in the vocabulary. And you then fully connect it to only one hidden layer, which has a dimension of v. V is this embedding dimension that you set and decide, the shorter vector length that you will be able to use afterwards. So you have a fully connected layer here, and then a fully connector to the output layer. And the output layer is simply a soft max with a layer that again has the dimension of the number of words in the vocabulary. And what you would do with this neural network is that you'd feed it pairs of words that are in each other's context, so a target word and a context word, a target word and a context word, and you try to predict the probability that these words are in each other's contexts. Now, once you've trained your network, what you'll use is not effectively using it as a predictor, but rather you'd extract the weights between these two layers. That would be an embedding matrix, and this embedding matrix is then the representation of your embedded vectors. So this is word2vec. Now that we've done that, let's take a look at how we would actually use this for code. So I told you about the naturalness of software hypothesis as well as the distributional hypothesis. If we put these two together, we might want to formulate a distributional hypothesis for code. And this goes something like that. Statements that occur in the same contexts tend to have similar semantics. Now, the words statements, context, and similar semantics are not so clear, so let's dive deeper into what that would mean. Let's start with statements. What are code statements, or equivalently, what type of statements do we want to use to then process code? The typical semantic units that are used in natural language are, words, sentences, paragraph, and documents, and these don't map one-to-one to the semantic units that we know from code, such as identifiers, statements, lines, basic blocks or functions, files, or even projects. So there's a choice to be made here. What are now the elements that will inform our choice? Well, one thing is, let's look, for example, at two statements from the Java language. The one that you have on the left, C is assigned to the value A or B, is a very short statement that contains very little information. You're just performing one Boolean operation. The one on the right, however, is a long and complex statement that in itself even contains the definition of a class. So evidently, a statement in a high-level language such as Java doesn't have any uniformity in the quantity of information represented by one statement. That's one concern. Another concern is the concern of universality. So looking at sort of two ends of the spectrums of what code could be, on one hand, someone sitting behind his laptop programming in a high-level programming language. The number of high-level programming languages available today is in the hundreds. There are the ones that we know very well and the ones we know less well. But focusing on any one of these high-level languages would then hinder universality. On another hand, going to assembly or machine-level language is again too specific, because each architecture has its instruction sets and its specificities, and you would again not be able to generalize whatever you learned to other hardware architectures. Ideally, we would like something in the middle. What we decided to go for is a language called LLVM-IR. LLVM-IR, IR is for intermediate representation, is the language that the LLVM suite outputs somewhere between the high-level language and the machine-level code. So it's an intermediate representation. It has a front end, so almost any high-level language, so any high-level language for which this front end exists can be compiled to LLVM-IR. And LLVM-IR can then be targeted towards a large number of architectures. Here you see an example of a statement in LLVM-IR, colored to sort of show the different parts. So LLVM-IR has SSA form, single static assignment, which means that in every line, every variable will get assigned only once, which allows you to follow the flow of data very well. So let's take a look at this statement. You start by an output identifier. This identifier %5 is a variable. It could be X or A in whatever high-level language you would want to represent. Then we have an instruction, here a load, the type which informs us on the instruction. So this is a load of what? Of a float. We then have an input identifier and more parameters, for example, here the alignment, and then we might have metadata as well as comments that go along with this statement. Oops, yes, next, context. How are we to represent context if we want to form target context pairs of words? Well, as we saw, taking the lexicographical context, which is the lines above and the lines below, is not enough to have an accurate representation of what are the statements in the context of another statement. In the top corner, you have a few lines in source code, and then the equivalent as it is compiled in LLVMIR. And the representation that we decided to use in order to represent what context might really mean is this contextual flow graph that you see at the right. So another representation which is known is data flow. And in data flow, these basic blocks, which are here represented as little rectangles, have the flow of what data goes where encoded inside of them. What these data flow blocks miss, though, is the control flow. So we have no notion of where branches go or where function calls might go. And that is exactly the loop that the XFG, contextual flow graph, is trying to fill in. So in here, you can see that the colors match the colors in the LLVMIR here on the left. The edges might represent both data and control dependencies, thus giving a much more complete view of what the context of one statement might be. Lastly, the last sentence that I didn't define yet is similar semantics. What are similar semantics? I think the clearest way is to sort of show it by an example. On the left, I have examples of statements that are similar, and on the right, examples of statements that are not similar. So similar statements might operate something similar, so they might all do comparisons, for example, as here. They might all operate on 32-bit integers. This is an example of two statements, one performing an addition, one a multiplication, both on 32-bit integers. That's something we'd call similar. And these are examples of statements we wouldn't call similar. So on the top, for example, a comparison between two 32-bit integers and then a conditional branch. There's no similarity between a conditional branch and a comparison between integers.
The similarities that you're looking at are only in terms of basically the words you pick. Like if you look at the top quadrant, for example, if I put in the instruction or the equivalent instruction of if I is equal to I or I is not equal to I, would that also be similar to these? In the context that we're talking about. Like if I have a comparison that's always true or always false, would that still be considered similar to these statements that are just
I see what you mean. We would regard them as similar because, okay, there's a bit of a question of compiler optimization in what you say, which I don't really want to touch, right? Yeah. So putting that aside, we would still regard them as similar because they do perform a comparison. And then the aspect of whether that would be optimized out in the production of code is kind of an annex question.
Okay. For similarity, do you only consider the actual instruction, or how do you define similarity when you have a very, let's say, the same operation but perform either on different integer types or with different signed or unsigned wrapping? Do you consider such statements similar?
So I'd love to just keep your question and get back to it a few slides later because I'll touch on that. Is that okay? Good. Great. So to get towards your questions and more, let's actually describe what inst2vec, this instruction to vector embedding space does. So we'd like to go from a corpora of LLVMIR to basically vectors that represent each one of these LLVMIR statements. I'll now go through how these things are done. We'll first start by describing how code is pre-processed, then how we build these XFGs, these contextual flow graphs to represent context, then how we extract statements from the raw form of LLVMIR, next how we actually form pairs of target context words, and finally how these embeddings are trained. Now, to pre-processing. So you have to know that LLVMIR is very clunky. When you look at a file of LLVMIR, you think, oh no, too much stuff, this is all messy. So the first thing that we do is sort of clean up the things that don't actually hold meaning of code. So this is an example. You'll see that this is actually from our training data set, and I cut a few lines here and there to kind of show you different aspects of that file. So the first thing that we do, highlighted in green, is we'd remove the commented lines because they don't mean anything. Next, we take off these things that are attributes and metadata, as well as at the top, like sort of general descriptions about what that file does. We would also remove the attributes and the metadata that are inlined. And then we would be left with these lines in black that actually hold, meaning this code does this, this is an operation. How do we then build a contextual flow graph from for example, this piece of LLVMIR? So an XFG is a directed multigraph, which means that two nodes could be connected by multiple edges. In this multigraph, nodes represent identifiers, so labels of basic blocks or variables in the code, and edges represent either data or control dependence. The way this XFG is built is simply in 2 O of n passes over the LLVMIR file. So in the first pass, we just store function names and their return type, just to have this stored aside. And then we go over the file once more, and from the root node, we just add each node which is connected, and we keep this dictionary of function and return files in order to make, then return statements in order to make the right connections. How do we extract statements? Well, so let's take a look at these few statements. This is, in the top lines, you see something that happens very often in LLVMIR, the declaration of a custom structure. So here, this class storage, for example, is an aggregate structure which contains a pointer to a float and then 2 64-bit integers. And this type is then named and reused later in the code under its name class object. And as we were training, we kind of bumped into a problem, which is that in several different files, the same structure name could refer to different real underlying structures, or the other way around, you could have 2 different names for the same real underlying structures. So one first thing we do is we just inline all of these structures and have explicit types everywhere so that we're sure to recognize the same statements in different files in our training set. Another thing we do is, if you take a look at let's say the first line here, we're storing a float, and this float carries the identifier %250. Now, you could imagine a different statement, which is store float %25, float star %8, a line 4. That would really be exactly the same statement. So I could replace these identifiers by different names, and I'm still holding the same operations. So we want to abstract away these specificities to this line to have a more general representation of what this statement is. So we replace these local identifiers just by a %ID token, and we also replace these immediate values, like this 1.3 that you see, by a generic token float. And we replace integers by ints and strings by strings as well. Now, given our XFG, we then need to actually make these target context pairs. And here I need to talk about a concept called context width. How wide is your context, or how far do you need to go to actually consider that one statement is in the context of another statement? So if we were to build the statements, the statement pairs of context width 1, we could take, for example, these 2 highlighted statements, because they are adjacent in the XFG. And then we'd end up with the following pair. And that would be 1 pair in our training set. And then we could imagine looking at slightly wider contexts, for example, of width 2. And the 2 boxes that you see highlighted here, this multiplication and the add, are just separated by 2 jumps or 2 edges in the XFG, and they would then form this pair of context width 2. And so on and so forth. You can go on with context widths of 3 as well. Now, in the vocabulary that you end up with before training, you kind of bump into a problem because some statements appear with very high frequency and other statements with very low frequency. So here you see examples of statements that appear with very high frequency. Adding 32-bit integers happens all the time. Allocating a 64-bit integer happens all the time. Unconditional and conditional branches are there all the time. On another hand, you have statements with very low frequency, like this first line, which is the declaration of a global variable with a very specific custom structure. That might not occur that often. Function calls with specific signatures are another example. How do you balance that out? It's a bit of a problem because you could imagine that if a statement doesn't appear often enough in your training data set, you won't end up with an accurate representation for it. On another hand, if a statement appears all the time, you will have to go over very, very large portions of training training data sets in order to see the statements that appear less often. So we sort of balance this out by subsampling the very frequent statements with a cutoff threshold, and the statements that appear very, very infrequently, we just replace them by an unknown token if they appear less than, say, 300 times. And these two methods are also found in Word2Vec, and they show that this improves both the accuracy and the speed of training. To actually train our model, we use the skipgram model, which I showed you earlier, the one with the matrix and the 3 layers. We use an Atom optimizer with default parameters and train it with an embedding dimension of 200. We also trained with 3 different context widths. So I showed you earlier that when you form the pairs, you might look at larger or narrower widths. We train them with 3 and then take a look at whether we end up with different representations. Now a word about our training data set. The motivation in choosing the training data set was twofold. On one hand, we want to have code from very different sources in order to reduce bias, and have very different code. And on another hand, we want code that is actually used, or that is high quality, that scientists might write. So in doing so, we take codes from very different projects. You see here benchmarks, libraries, a bit of TensorFlow, BLAS, as well as OpenCV. And this data set also contains code from different languages. So we have some C and C++, some Fortran in the BLAS, as well as some OpenCL and some benchmarks. And since all of these languages can be compiled to LLVMIR, we're able to incorporate all of these different languages into our training data set. Now let's look at what this embedding space actually looks like. So here I'm showing you the t-SNE projection in 2D of our training data, of our embeddings, once with context width 1, 2, and 3. And the colors that you see here are categories that we came up with in order to take a look to have something interpretable. And the categories correspond to things like a function call, additions of integers, or branches, or different terminator instructions, for example. So we color all of these and project them and take a look at what this embedding space looks like projected in 2D. Now, first thing you can see is that the context width of 1 and 3 display a large number of outliers that are sort of floating around, and that the clusters aren't very clear. You don't have very pure clusters of a single color. The context width of 2, on the other hand, does display blue, yellow, and green clusters that you can see. So this is a first indication that our context width of 2 displays results that might actually be usable. For another qualitative evaluation, we take a look at the statements that appear very often and just output their top 5 neighbors and ask ourselves, well, are these actually similar statements? Is this exhibiting the type of properties that we would like it to? So here you have 3 examples. You see that in the top one, this comparison is followed by other comparisons and operations on 64-bit integers. This extract value here is followed by insert values and extract value of the same structure as well. And then here, the declaration of a global variable is followed by declaration of similar global variables. So this is not making sort of a numeric or strong claim, but just as a first, taking a look at the statements which appear often and just qualitatively looking at their neighbors gives us an indication that this embedding space actually represents something and exhibits the type of properties that we want it to. Now, and I'm coming back to the question that you asked earlier, we're going to take a look at analogies. So analogies are sort of what made Word2Vec kind of famous and awesome and appealing, because in the embedding space that Word2Vec came up with, they showed that semantic relationships that we know, like the relationship between masculine and feminine, are actually represented in the space in terms of subtractions of vectors. So you could take the vector for woman minus the vector for man, plus the vector for queen, and end up with a vector for king. And that was something very appealing. So we tried to do something similar with LLVMIR statements. Could we, for example, take the addition for 60, could our embedding space learn the relationship between 64-bit integers and doubles, for example, and say, well, the addition of a 64-bit integer is to the addition of a double, what the subtraction of a 64-bit integer is to the subtraction of a double. Now, since LLVMIR is so formal and has such a clear structure, it's very easily to just programmatically generate a very large number of such questions. So we can come up with a very, very large number of analogy questions and just go ahead and evaluate them. So to evaluate them, we just really perform a subtraction and addition of vectors. And the point that we end up with, we then just look at its 5 top neighbors and check, well, is the answer that we wanted to in the top 5 neighbors? If it is, we consider the question correctly answered. The distance metric that we look at is cosine similarity. That's the distance metric that everyone who does analogies and embedding spaces look at. Now for some results. So we generated a bunch of different analogies of different categories, and we here show on the different lines, 1, 2, 3, the score obtained for different context widths. So you see again that a lot of questions are answered correctly, notably in the ones about data structures. So it seems clear that our embedding space does capture a lot of information about type. And it is also clear that the scores are a lot higher in the context width of 2, which gives us a further hint that this context width is indeed appropriate and has a good representation of what we're trying to achieve. Lastly, we try to numerically evaluate how pure our clusters are, in a sense. So we semantic tests by taking a family of statements, and then we look, well, given any statement in this family of statements, are the other statements in this category closer to it than statements outside of the category, and just output a score for that for different families. So the families we came up with are branches, terminators, additions of integers, additions of floating points, and then more bitwise binary operations and other examples that you see in the leftmost column. Again, we end up with relatively high scores, and the context width of 2 exhibits the best scores. I just have to say one note on all of these evaluations. All of these things are sort of an attempt to look at the embedding space in and of itself. So before thinking, oh well, is my embedding space useful? Can I use it on a downstream task? Can I actually evaluate the embedding space in itself and say something about it? And that is not such an easy task, because the vector representation of one statement by its own is not interpretable. You can't give me a vector embedding and I'll tell you, oh look, the first component means the type and it is exactly that, it's good. It's not interpretable in and of itself. Rather, it's only interpretable in its relationships to other vectors. So that's sort of what we attempt to do here. And we also have to say that, to our knowledge, we're the first to come up with analogy scores for code statements. So we have found previous works that do it, for example, for I believe names of variables and names of functions, which you could argue whether that is code in the sense that it is an identifier and a name chosen by the programmer. And we are the first to actually show some analogy scores for statements of code. That's why there are no comparisons in the slides that I showed you earlier. So now that we have a good idea, we can say with confidence that our embedding space is pretty good. We have to figure out whether it's useful. To figure out whether it's useful, we make use of of recurrent neural networks, which I'll call RNN from now on. What RNNs do, they're a specific type of neural networks that is therefore whose use is to look at lists or sequences of numbers. So if you take an example, you might have a sequence here in these little blue squares. Your sequence may be a sentence, or in our case, a program, which is a sequence of statements. You make it run through your network as so, and it outputs one output, but also whatever element came in the neural network just before is remembered and is passed down through the architecture to the next one. So now, as the second blue box here enters the neural network, it also benefits from the information that was input into it before, which allows it to learn over sequences. That's the whole point. So running through such a neural network might symbolically look something like this. And at the end, you might end up with a different sequence, this purple sequence at the top, which is the process sequence, where hopefully the neural network learned something. So how did we use inst2vec for useful, hopefully, machine learning tasks? I'll quickly go over the neural code comprehension architecture, how we did this. So given a certain number of LLVMIR files and a certain number of statements in this file, one statement is looked up into the embedding. So we take a look, well, what is the vector that corresponds to it? And we call this first layer the embedding lookup and input layer. Then we make it go through an LSTM. An LSTM is just a specific type of RNN, of recurrent neural network. That's what I just showed you earlier. And we actually make it go through a double sequence. Then we look at the next statement and the next statement. And once we've gone through all of the statement, we end up with a sequence which characterizes a program. So this first part is a program characterization. Then, if we want to have some auxiliary input that is not in the code, something, for example, like data size or some information that might only be available at runtime, we can include it at this point. We then perform batch normalization, make it go through a dense layer, and our last layer is a classification layer with a softmax with a number of categories on which we're classifying. So this is the architecture with which we'll be working. Now, you might notice that this architecture has something missing, or there's something that we ignore about the statements, rather. If you remember earlier, I told you that we abstract identifiers as well as immediate values. So this information here, for example, this 1.3, is lost at the moment at which we train, because it is replaced by this float. But you could imagine that this might actually be important depending on your task. So we provide 3 methods to reintegrate this information about immediate values into the learning. So we look at our statement, and we take a look also at the immediate values that come attached to it. They're the ones here at the top. In a first sort of naive way of looking at immediate values, we just concatenate them at that point. That's the plus symbol here. And then we just go through the regular, the rest of the layers as we did for the regular neural network architecture. Another way of looking at it, again, extracting the immediate values at this point, concatenating them there. Before actually going through program characterization, we make this go through one more dense layer. So we sort of re-embed the statements together with their immediates before going through program characterization and the rest of the layers. And then the third method that we looked at, we call this extract concat, for extract and then concatenate. What we do here, again, we take the immediate values that come from the statement, and then instead of doing program characterization and immediate value characterization together, we make the immediate values go through their own LSTM, through their own recurrent neural network. Then we concatenate them at that point and go through the rest of the layers, as we did in previous examples. What can this neural network actually be used for? So our motivation in looking for tasks for this was twofold. On one hand, we wanted to be diverse. We would like to show that this architecture is versatile and can solve a number of different problems. And on the other hand, we'd like it to be easily comparable to other methods. So if there are readily available data sets, for example, that is of course a big plus. The three tasks we looked at are algorithm classification, optimal device mapping prediction, as well as optimal thread coarsening factor prediction. So the first task is really a code understanding task. We'd like to know, given an algorithm, what kind of algorithm is this? What does this code do? And classify it. And the two next tasks have much more of a performance aspect. So how can I have an idea about the runtime or the performance of a code just by reading it and not by actually running it? Let's look at the first task. So in the first task, we compare against a work by Mu et al., in which they come up with a very specific neural architecture designed to solve exactly this problem. And their neural architecture contains specialized layers such as dynamic pooling and tree convolutions. We compare against them, and you can see that we outperformed them by 0.83% here. So this is the result shown in this paper, in the Mu et al. Paper, and the results they compare against. And we outperformed them here on a classification on 104 tasks. Moving on to the next task, we now compare against this paper, end-to-end deep learning of optimization heuristics. And the task we're trying to solve now is, given a kernel, can I predict whether it's better to run it on the CPU or on the GPU? Just by reading the kernel and not by actually running the kernel. So we do this for two platforms, and about 600. Our training data set is something like 600 OpenCL kernels. And we compare here against DeepTune, the paper that I showed you earlier, as well as against another method, Gru et al., which use hand-engineered features. So they don't have a method which automatically extracts features from code, but rather they come up with a hand-engineered way of doing so. You can see that in prediction accuracy as well as in speedup, our naive concatenation method outperforms DeepTune as well as Gru et al. But that the stripped down version of a neural code comprehension without the immediate values does not surpass DeepTune in all cases. But taking the immediate values into account, we surpass them by a large margin. In the second table, I'm just comparing the different training modes of neural code comprehension, so ignoring immediate values and then using the naive concatenation, the extract then concat, or concat then embed methods. And you can see that the prediction accuracies as well as the speed up do vary. In the last task that we looked at a number of kernels also in OpenCL, and the question we were trying to solve here is, how can I bunch threads together into one group in such a way that the runtime will be shorter? So what is the factor, or how many threads do I want to bunch together in one group in order to end up with the optimal performance? We compare against the same paper as I showed you earlier, DeepTune, DeepTune themselves compare against Magni, again, an older method which uses hand-engineered code features. And DeepTune TL here stands for transfer learning. So what they do here is they take the embeddings that they learned in the previous task and reuse them for this task. They do so because there's a much larger training data set for the previous task than for this one. So in the previous task, they train on something like 600 different kernels, and in this task, it's only 17. You see that these experiments are performed on 4 different hardware architectures and that the results do vary from architecture to architecture. So InstVec only sporadically outperforms DeepTune transfer learning, though it does outperform DeepTune consistently. Another point for our method is that while DeepTune and DeepTune TL sometimes suggest a coarsening factor which slows the performance down in the last architecture here, for example, InstVec never does. In the second table, like before, I just compare the different modes of training for neural code comprehension and see what results we come up here. And again, you see that there is no clear vote for one. Sorry, not again. Unlike in the previous task, we cannot tell that there is one clear method that surpasses the rest. Rather, the results are pretty variable. So we attribute the fact that we don't beat DeepTune and DeepTune TL in this case to 2 things. One thing is that their embedding space isn't trained separately from the downstream task as we do it. So we train InstVec this embedding space, freeze that embedding matrix, and then train a different neural architecture, while they train the 2 together. So the embedding spaces might be sort of fine-tuned to the downstream task, while we do not have that. And another aspect is that really the training data set for this task is very small. And it could be that on this very small training data set, things are just sort of a little irregular, and our learning doesn't perform as well as theirs. I'll give you an overview to finish. So what does neural code comprehension allow us? Given a file or code in almost virtually any high-level programming language, we can make it go through this LLVM front end. It ends up in an SSA representation, LLVM IR, this intermediate representation that I showed you. From these statements, we can then build a contextual flow graph, which is an accurate representation of context in which both data and control dependencies are featured. This IXFG allows us to train InstVec, instruction to vector embedding space, for LLVM IR, and have embedding vectors for each statement that actually contain information about the different statements. And then through a series of RNNs and a dense layer, different tasks might be programmed from here. You could imagine malicious code detection as well as guided programming and others. And the 3 ones that I showed you show that this architecture does both code understanding, so more semantic tasks, as well as performance prediction. I'll just end up with a few ideas of future work. So future work, one point is, well, there are more downstream tasks that could be explored. We have not done that many of them. In particular, there are downstream tasks that have more prior work than the ones we've shown. Code and function summarization is a popular one. Function, class, or variable naming is another popular one, as well as smart code copy pasting, which to my knowledge doesn't have very good results up to now. Another idea would be to go towards part-based models. So part-based models have been tried in the world of Word2Vec, and the intuition lying behind it is that there are words that are composed. I think, for example, of happy and happily. If I know something about happy, then I might also know something about what the word happily means. And since LLVM IR has such a regular structure, there might be something to gain from chopping up statements in different parts and using part-based models. Another idea is that the programs that we actually feed to the downstream neural network are fed as sequences of LLVM IR statements. So I showed you this RNN with sequences of statements. What we do there is we kind of go back to viewing the program as a linear sequence of statements, which sort of is a pity because we make a big point about how graphs might be a more accurate representation of code. So future work might include exploring how programs could be represented as graphs and then trained on downstream tasks, and whether that would allow more impressive results. A further idea is that, so in the performance tasks that we look at, none of them include actual knowledge about the hardware. And you've seen in the two last tasks that I showed you, the device mapping and the thread coarsening, we trained on different hardware and showed that we have very different results on different hardware. So perhaps incorporating knowledge about the hardware in the way we train might sort of help us overcome that. Great. I'd like to thank you for your attention and also let you know that this project is on GitHub on SPCL, the Scalable Parallel Systems Lab page. So you can take a look at it and give it a try. Thank you for your attention.